Welcome to the side event, to the 60th session of the Human Rights Council. Today's event brings distinguished guests that I'm going to introduce in a few minutes to delve into the issue of the systemic nature of arbitrary detention in China. This event is co-sponsored by the Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and my own organization, the International Service for Human Rights. My name is Raphael, Viana. I'm Program Manager for China at ISHR, and I have the privilege of moderating today's discussion. So I'll do a little brief introduction of our panelists. We are first joined today by the UN Special Rapporteur on Situation of Human Rights Defenders, Mary Lawlor, that I think is a very well-known figure in this council. Hi, Mary. We are also joined by Sophie Richardson, a longtime activist and now co-executive director of the Network of Chinese Human Rights Defenders. I also have the pleasure to welcome today Rizwangul NurMuhammed, who is a Uyghur human rights advocate and a PhD candidate at the University of Sheffield. Rizwangul left China in 2010, and she now leads the Uyghurs at the UN initiative. And last but not least, we're joined by our dear colleague Yalkun Uluyol, who's China researcher at Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much for joining us today. During today's panel, we'll also listen to video remarks by Ana Lorena Delgadillo Perez, who is a member of the UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances. After these interventions, we will open for a brief Q&A segment, and we will be very glad to hear remarks or questions from the floor. Regrettably, we had extended an invitation to deliver remarks to High Commissioner Volker Turk and the OSCHR, who have declined to provide opening remarks to this event. Before starting, a couple of housekeeping rules. I would like to stress our zero tolerance policy for any instance of intimidation or reprisal against any of our speakers or any civil society colleague that is in the room today. This can take, of course, the form of oral interventions or unauthorized pictures. Be assured that we will not tolerate any derogatory remark, and I will interrupt any speaker that will do so. We are today joined by my colleague Christine Dauphin in the corner right of the room. That is the only person that is authorized with press to take pictures or videos. If you'd not like to be photographed, please kindly indicate it to her. And lastly, to ensure that the live stream works well, I will ask all panelists and those speaking from the floor during the Q&A to make sure that you mute your mic once you end your intervention by clicking on the red button to ensure that we can see the correct person on the screen just above us and online. Just perhaps just a few words of background very briefly on this event. Of course, arbitrary detention is one of the first human rights violations that documented when one starts looking at the human rights situation in China. The idea today is not to scratch the surface, but rather to really delve into how is arbitrary detention widespread and systematic across the country. And of course, to do so, we need to look at facts and we need to look at data. The Chinese government regularly tries to dilute the reality of these human rights abuses by giving us a very important number of facts of data that are meant to represent the reality. Well, today we're also going to present facts and data that are backed by UN bodies, in particular the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and the OSCHR. As I'm sure that everybody in this room knows, the OSCHR released 3 years ago a landmark report in August 2022 finding the possible commission of crimes against humanity in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and against Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim groups. Organizations have regularly urged High Commissioner Turk, most recently through press releases by, I believe, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, to ensure meaningful follow-up to this report that is grounding in the finding of widespread and arbitrary detention. Unfortunately, we have observed that High Commission has failed over the past year to mention this report in global updates at the HRC, and most recently yesterday, where he only stated that the progress sought for the protection of the rights of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang has yet to materialize. I believe that some of our panelists will delve into this matter of public diplomacy or the lack thereof. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, arbitrary detention is not just documented in numbers, but in the lived realities of those that are affected and impacted by the victims and their relatives. And those, like some of our panelists, that have fought very long to be reunited with their loved ones. And I would like today also that we ensure that the discussions are really centered in their reality and their needs. With this in mind, I'll turn first to our first distinguished panelist, Mary Lawlor. Mary, thank you again so much for joining us. It's been almost 6 years of your tenure now as a special rapporteur, and you have regularly sought to engage with the Chinese authorities to raise the situation of human rights defenders in long-term detention, a priority for you. So from your experience, what I'd like to ask you is, what can you tell us about the patterns of arbitrary detention in China? And most importantly, what urgent steps should the government take in that regard?
Thank you very much for having me here today. And I'd like to welcome China. Friends from China. It's a country I have huge regard for. Its people. But unfortunately, I don't have the same regard for the human rights violations that continue to take place there. Over the past 5 years, as Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, the long-term imprisonment of human rights defenders has been a priority for me, and we continue to track the cases of 98 human rights defenders serving 10 years or more in prison in 17 countries. I chose the issue of long-term imprisonment as a priority because I think it's one of the cruelest forms of punishment a state can impose on a peaceful activist and human rights defenders. Most of us here work in advocacy, and we know how difficult it is to sustain interest in a case year after year where there are no significant new developments or where it is not possible to get any information on a person's situation because of communication bans or suspensions. All the while, we also know that the imprisoned human rights defenders' health often greatly deteriorates in the shadows, while increasingly only their family members hold the torch for their release. All of this plays into the hands of hostile governments, which weaponize the information flow even further by often transferring imprisoned human rights defenders thousands of miles away from their homes, making it ever more difficult to get out whatever scant information is permitted to be shared about the defender. Of those 98 cases that we're following, we are following 10 in China. We are aware that this is most likely an undercount, but when we started compiling the list, these were the defenders whose consent we were able to obtain through lawyers or family members. And I must acknowledge the support of and express gratitude to many of the organizations in the room today. Earlier this year, I wrote again to the government of China to express my concerns about 8 of these defenders, having initially written in 2021 and written to the government last year about the remaining 2 on our list of 10, Gulshan Abbas and I can never pronounce names, I'm sorry. I sought specific information about their conditions, their health circumstances, allegations of ill treatment and torture, and their access to family and council visits, and the continued disappearance of Gao Zhisheng. As I noted in a press release last month, once again the Chinese government responded with a largely general information, only providing even some of the specific information requested in 2 of the cases. The response provided no further information whatsoever on the whereabouts of Gao Zhisheng, instead restating that he was released in 2014, yet in a previous response to special procedures in 2017, the government said that the public security authorities have carried out an inquiry into his reported disappearance in accordance with the law, and the case is still currently open. The conflicting official response in Gao's case is emblematic of the lack of accountability that China faces, a lack which will become all the more pronounced as it rushes to fill the vacuum left by the US and other governments at the UN and other multinational bodies. As China presses ahead in its attempts to reshape the global order in its own image, it is crucial for us, special procedures, OHCHR, civil society, anyone who holds dear the values enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to highlight the violations and to continue to seek accountability. And although this may sometimes seem like an exercise in futility, given the power imbalance at play, there are two things which lead me to believe it is worthwhile. Firstly, from having talked to scores of formerly imprisoned human rights defenders, I know how much such expressions of solidarity can mean to them and to their families. After a recent communication on an imprisoned defender in China, the family sent us a message expressing thanks and emphasizing how important the support is to them. There is a quote I love which goes, and I always use it, "Solidarity is the last weapon of the defenseless." And time again, we have seen this when it comes to human rights defenders in the most difficult of circumstances. Secondly, the odd time we do hear that advocacy has made a tangible difference to the situation of human rights defenders in China. Over the course of my mandate, we have received information that one prisoner was provided television privileges, another permitted a video call with a family member, while a third was granted access to books. Yet these are all these are all very small things, and they are not, of course, release or exoneration. However, if you are serving 10 years of jail or more, these small changes can make a huge difference to the quality of your life in prison. In closing, I would urge the NGOs in the room to consider specific work streams on long-term imprisoned human rights defenders in China. I know some of you have done great work, particularly in relation to the Tiananmen generation and the imprisonment afterwards, but I would love to see a platform hosted by a number of China-focused organizations which concentrates on and keeps alive the cases of these defenders serving lengthy prison terms. States, you really have to up your game and continue to include the names of such prisoners in your lists in human rights dialogues and with your interactions with your colleagues in China. And you must be making efforts to visit them where wanted or engage with family members to let them know that they have not been forgotten. But most of all, you have to stop being afraid of China. Let me finish with a quote from the great modernist writer Lu Xun, who spoke about the collective responsibility of keeping hope alive. He wrote, "Hope is like a path in the countryside. Originally there is nothing, but as people walk this way again and again, a path appears." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for remarks that always inspire hope despite everything. And I think this quote of Lu Xun is really beautiful and has inspired a lot of movements, not only human rights movements, more broadly and in China. I did a rapid calculation this morning, Mary, and I saw, if I'm not mistaken, that you joined at least 35 or led 35 letters to China since you took office, and that concerns at least 70 human rights defenders cases. So I think on behalf of the same organizations, we really wanted to thank you for your support. I'll pass now to Sophie. Sophie, it's a pleasure to have you here. Your organization, CEST, released a major report on arbitrary detention in China last March. Briefly, can you tell us more about the legal and policy framework that allows for arbitrary detention in China and Hong Kong?
Great, thank you, and thanks everyone for being here for this conversation. On paper, people across China have some fairly strong guarantees to human rights between the international laws, the CAT, the ICSCR, and the ICCPR, the latter two of which both still pertain in Hong Kong. Chapter 2 of the PRC's Constitution and Article 2 of the Criminal Procedure Law, taken together, those guarantee state respect for a broad swath of human rights, including speech, assembly, association, and religious belief. They also guarantee rights to fair trials, legal certainty, the rights to and of defense counsel, and access for family members to people who are detained. And they also include prohibitions against torture and arbitrary deprivation of liberty. That's what happens on paper. Here's what's happening in reality. Our and others' research shows that the Chinese government routinely criminalizes peaceful expression that's critical of the government, treating it as a national security threat. It uses overly broad laws on national security, terrorism, and picking quarrels and provoking troubles. This is a particular issue with the PRC criminal law and the Hong Kong national security law. And it routinely denies fair trial rights, access to and of counsel and family, inflicts torture on people who are detained, and imposes arbitrary detention. To give you some more specifics from our report earlier this year, we found that between 2019 and 2024, 1,545 people were convicted in violation of their rights simply for exercising their human rights or defending other people's. The average sentence across this universe of cases was 6 years. That rose to 7 if national security charges were implicated. The 3 charges that were most commonly used were picking quarrels and provoking trouble, endangering national security, or using a cult to undermine the law. 700 of these 1,500 people were over the age of 60, and 2/3 of those people were women. So there are also questions here about discrimination and access to defense and counsel. More people in Hong Kong were convicted on charges related to subversion during this time than those in the mainland. Tibetan prisoners of conscience were particularly subject to charges of separatism, while Uyghurs and Kazakhs received especially harsh sentences. And Mary, to your point, thank you, first of all, for your extraordinary work. 48 of these 1,500 people received sentences of 10 years or more. And just as a final point, many of these people, even after release, continue to endure what we refer to as non-release release, meaning being subject to additional forms of arbitrary deprivation of liberty after they have actually served sentences that involved arbitrary deprivations of liberty. So hopefully, Raf, that gives you a sense of what the landscape looks like domestically.
Thank you, Sophie. Yes, it absolutely does. And a lot of the crimes that you mentioned were asked to be repealed directly by the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and a lot of special procedures. So picking, quarreling, provoking trouble, and also inciting subversion of state power, which is a national security crime. I'll pass it on now to Rizwangul. Rizwangul, we're really deeply grateful. I think a particular thank you for your willingness to share your story today, as we know that you face a lot of risks in sharing that story over time. Rizwangul, the Uyghurs and other Muslim people, have endured a form of arbitrary detention that is so widespread that led the OACHR to conclude that crimes against humanity could have possibly been committed. One of those affected has been your brother. So could you tell us a little bit more about this and the story and why does this report matter so much to you?
Thank you, Raphael. Thank you for the Mary and Sophie. Thank you. And I thank you for representative from China. For years, I have been seeking to speak to China directly and even get my brother released to get his freedom back through quiet diplomacy. And now it's escalated to the UN. Thank you for coming and listening to us. Thank you for all of you to come and listen our voices, the voices of victims, voices of those who are left without any protection. My brother Mawlan NurMuhammed, he was arrested on 17th of January 2017 while having lunch break in a local restaurant during his work break. At that time, he was a full-time employee with China Telecom, and he has just registered his own small business, which began operating in early January. This is his last social post on 8th of January 2017, asking support, friends, family, support my business. He was a family's breadwinner, a father, a husband, a son, a brother, an ordinary and decent citizen. He was the family's beloved member. Yet he was arrested and sentenced to 9 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit, with no justification other than his identity as Uyghur. His detention exemplifies how arbitrary detention of Uyghurs has been carried out by Chinese authorities. Local police, dressed in plain clothes, without uniforms, without identification, conducting the arrest without a warrant, explanation, or citing any legal basis. Following the arrest, access to independent lawyers is severely restricted, while complaint mechanisms are ineffective, inaccessible, and often expose those who attempt to use them to retaliation. Detainees are denied regular family contact, cut off from outside the world, and their relatives are left without information on their health and well-being. I am one of them. I don't have any information about especially his well-being for years now. And my brother's case is not isolated, but part of a broader, deliberate, widespread, and systematic policy targeting Uyghur civilians through arbitrary detention, torture, and persecution. In the past several months, I have spoken with 49 Uyghur diaspora families. Together, they reported 253 cases of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance, almost 5 relatives per family on average. These 253 are not just numbers. They are fathers, mothers, siblings, uncles, aunties, people who had dreams, lives, and roles as the very fabric of the Uyghur society, and contributing to their families and communities, to the Chinese state at large. Yet all were looked away by that very state. There were no arrest warranties, no fair trials, no appeals, no access to lawyers, and no family contact. Only disappearance into darkness, without information or accountability. Today I'm here carrying not only the grief of my family, but families of all these Uyghur families, millions of them. This pattern of arbitrary detention carried out systematically by the Chinese authorities continues today. It is estimated that at least 2-3 million more Uyghurs remaining disappeared, arbitrarily detained, and their stories, situations still waiting to be uncovered, documented. The 2022 report by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights documented serious procedural flaws in the Chinese government's handling of detentions. It is an important and valuable document because it provides an official acknowledgement of serious human rights violations against Uyghurs in China. By systematically documenting patterns of arbitrary detention, restrictions on legal access, and enforced disappearance, the report validates the lived experience of Uyghur victims, giving weight and legitimacy to our claims. The report also provides concrete recommendations, including releasing the detainees, providing information about their family members, and allowing monitoring by international observers, offering a roadmap for accountability. However, the recommendations have not been implemented. It has been 3 years. Chinese authorities have not provided access to independent lawyers, addressed arbitrary detentions, or made complaint mechanism effective. This indication directly impacts us, Uyghur victims, and our family members in diaspora, inside and outside China. It leaves us as isolated, with reduced visibility, without legal options, without legal protections, and living in fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. Making it harder for us to report abuses and seek justice, and even talk to our family members, even just over phone call. What they need is just a peace. Peace with respect, with dignity, equal opportunity for development. Just human life, decent life, which has been deprived from us. The rest, I will leave it for you all to think and act. Thank you.
So much, Rizwangul, for your really compelling testimony. And the only thing that I can say is that I think a lot of people in this room will continue to work as hard as possible until your brother and everyone else is free again, and as you say, can live their dreams again. But in the meantime, I really wanted to thank you for this really compelling testimony. Thank you. Yalkun, I would like to now turn to you in your counting on your expertise, of course, as a researcher, but also as a Uyghur. And I would like to ask you two questions. One is the question that I asked Rizwangul, which is, why does the OACHR report matter, of course, to you and others in a similar, others that are also facing abuses in the Uyghur region, and to what extent the patterns that you have documented at Human Rights Watch, you've seen them also in other regions, in particular in Tibet, Hong Kong, or in mainland China?
Thank you very much. It's very difficult to speak after Rizwangul, especially with such an amazing, moving, and factual intervention. And I also would like to thank Mary and Sophie for their remarks, and Raph for those tough questions to answer. In today's China, criticizing Xi Jinping by putting a banner over a bridge can result in enforced disappearances. In Tibet, having a picture of His Holiness Dalai Lama can get you arrested and imprisoned. And in Xinjiang, simply contacting your loved ones abroad can result in house raids, arbitrary detention, and even imprisonment. In Hong Kong, since the implementation of national security law, people are facing up to life imprisonment for exercising their basic rights. There is no freedom of expression, assembly, or religion in China. When you want to exercise these rights, the Chinese government weaponizes the legal system and puts you in prison without a due process, what we call arbitrary detention. And when you hire a lawyer to defend your rights, Beijing also persecutes and silences rights who dare to challenge the Chinese Communist Party's political agenda. And this year actually marks 10-year anniversary of the Chinese government's crackdown on rights lawyers, known as 709 crackdown. For the Chinese government, that is the normalcy, and that is normal since Xi Jinping came to power. It rejects every single criticisms, denies UN's findings about its human rights violations, and does not implement recommendations set out by UN experts like Special Rapporteur Mary Lawlor. The UN human rights bodies, including, and in particular UN Human Rights Council, should hold Chinese government accountable. So as a Uyghur myself, one day my father called me in rush and said, "Hey, take care of your mom and sister," he said. And I asked like, what happened? And whom should I ask you from if I don't hear back from you? At that point, he was one of the last persons who left in my WeChat, the Chinese equivalent of WhatsApp. And he told me like, nobody but yourself. Then he disappeared. After 15 days, he came back online. I figured he was briefly detained and then released. It happened a couple of times. It was at the peak of Strike Hard campaign against my people in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, during which Chinese government arbitrarily detained an estimated 1 million Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims and committed abuses that amount to crimes against humanity. After a couple of months, my father again disappeared, and this time I didn't hear back from him. And this time it was without a farewell or without a last note, "Oh, take care of your mom." He said it last time, right? And then it took me about 2 years to figure if he was alive. I traced him to one of the political re-education camps in my hometown, and it took me another 2 years to figure that he is serving 16 years in prison. I don't know his exact location. I don't know his health conditions. My father, Mehmet Yaqub, a former civil servant and a businessman, is one of the victims, just like my uncle Ahmet Yaqub, his business partner, who is serving life imprisonment. another uncle, Yaqub Sharul, who is serving, he's a farmer, who is serving 15 years. And his son, Iskandar, who is serving 15 years after being paralyzed in one of the camps. And now I don't know where they are. All of them were convicted without a due process and had committed no recognizable crime. I'm not really sure how many of my relatives will be affected after today. Just like Rizwangul's brother, Mevlan, just because they are Uyghur, the Chinese government weaponized the legal system to conflate everyday life of Uyghurs with terrorism, and arbitrarily detained and imprisoned Uyghurs for growing a beard, learning Quran, or wearing a headscarf, or visiting a country that the authorities deemed sensitive. Conducting anthropological research about Uyghur history and culture can lead to life imprisonment, even if you work as a full professor in one of the most reputable universities, like Rahila Dawood. The government orders you to design a textbook for kids. You bring Uyghurs' historical figures into the content, and then all of a sudden authority decided that you are inciting subversion of state power and sentenced you 15 years in prison. That is Yalkun Rozi. The list goes on with Ilham Tohti, Akbar Assad, Gulshan Abbas, and many others that led the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to conclude that the Chinese government's abuses in Xinjiang may amount to international crimes, in particular crimes against humanity. The Chinese government should implement recommendations from UN assessment of Xinjiang in 2022. It's been 3 years. Free all those arbitrarily detained, including my family members and Rizwangul's brother, of course, and wrongfully imprisoned, and ensure their basic rights. The Human Rights Council, member states, and other stakeholders should hold the Chinese government accountable for its crimes against humanity. And it is their responsibility, because we are like talking about crimes against humanity as if it's a simple 3 words, right? And we need a robust follow-up. As Raf mentioned, the High Commissioner Volker Turk briefed the HRC yesterday. He read out the statement, and that is a strong indication that we need a robust follow-up. 3 years since the UN report, UN Rights Chief should strengthen his efforts to press the Chinese government to implement UN recommendations, provide the HRC with a comprehensive public update before the next Human Rights Council. Thank you, Raf. I'll pass it to you.
For this important reminder, Yalkun. I would like now to turn to a video, hopefully that this is going to work, from Ana Lorena Delgadillo Perez, who is a member of the UN Working Group on on enforced disappearances. In particular, because for those of us that have documented arbitrary detention in China, we know that they're a part of a spectrum of abuses that victims face, and that spectrum is often very closely tied to enforced disappearances. In particular, a couple of forms of egregious forms of disappearances and secret detention that the working group has documented.
Good day. My name is Ana Lorena Delgadillo Perez. I am a member of the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances of United Nations, and I am Mexican. I am very happy to be here today sharing this message with you. First of all, I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to the Chinese Network of Human Rights Defenders and to the event organizers for convening this very important gathering to honor the victims of enforced disappearances and some other violations in China, in the pursuit for truth, justice, and reparation. In December 2010, the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed 30 August as the International Day of the Victims of Enforced Disappearances, an annual observances that brings together victims, families, civil society, and other institutional stakeholders. This year, the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearance and the Committee on Enforced Disappearances commemorate the day in cooperation with several regional human rights mechanisms, including the International Commissions on Human Rights, the African Commission on Humans and People's Rights, the Commissioner for Rights on the Council of Europe, and the Asian Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Together, we reiterate our call to all states to end the practice of enforced disappearance, to prevent the profound suffering they inflict, to adopt effective preventive measures, and to ensure victims access to search, justice, and to all the remedies, and that the perpetrators are held accountable in accordance with the gravity of the harm caused. Distinguished victims and colleagues, this side event, held in the margins of 16th session of the Human Rights Council, reflects our shared commitments to addressing enforced disappearances wherever they occur, and to confronting their devastating consequences for victims, families, and their communities. We have seen many organizations and victims from China demanding an answer for cases of enforced disappearances, and we want to say to you, thank you for all the work that you have been doing. Thank you for your courage, your resilience, and your dignity. You must continue doing this because it's necessary for your country and it's necessary for the victims. You are an inspiration for us and for many other organizations and victims around the world. In China, the working group remains deeply concerned by ongoing and increasing reports of repression targeting artistic, cultural, political, and religious expression, particularly those associated with minority communities or individuals critical of the government. We strongly condemned also the persistent pattern of transnational repression where the government, through coordination, acquiescence, or cooperation with other member states, seeks to silence dissenting voices and minority expression beyond its borders. We are increasingly receiving allegations of enforced disappearances of Chinese victims taking the form of abductions and other acts of transnational repression in violation of the principle of non-refoulement, as well as incommunicado detention under the opaque systems of deprivation of liberty, such as the residential surveillance as a designated location RSDL, and the Uluyol, often in response to the free exercise of fundamental rights or legitimate business activities. The crime of enforced disappearances has particularly severe impacts for the victims and their families, but also for community societies and for countries. It affects fundamental rights of a person, but also it affects democracies. It installs pervasive fear in any person who might be at risk, and its invisibility compounds the suffering. Enforced disappearances is considered a torture, and the consequences remain for generations in families, communities, and societies. While the working group statistics cannot reflect the full scope of the situation, because we know that many of the family members are afraid to report a case of enforced disappearances due to the fear of reprisal, it is troubling that only 319 cases have been transmitted under its humanitarian procedure since 1980. It is against this backdrop that the Chinese government denies the existence of the crime of enforced disappearance in China, even though every case that has been sent by the working group contains the elements of enforced disappearance. In nearly all the cases transmitted by the working group, families were not informed of the circumstances of the disappearance, the location of the detention, or the well-being of their loved ones. Often relatives only learn about the fate or whereabouts of the loved ones through the response that the government is giving to the special procedures of the United Nations. Victims are frequently abducted, held in incommunicado detention, sometimes tortured, and later subject to closed trials with multiple violations of due process of law, resulting in harsh sentences without ever being allowed to contact the lawyer that they want to have or their families, which are themselves, the families, placed under strict surveillance by authorities, which is indeed a form of criminalization or a constant threat. This occurs in a generalized environment of fear and intimidation, where, as I said before, reporting a case of enforced disappearance in China or asking for the search for a loved one is itself dangerous. And this is what distinguishes enforced disappearances from some other violations. The deliberated severeness of contact with the outside world places the victim beyond the protection of the law and causes enduring harm to families, civil society, and communities themselves. These acts violate international norms protecting the right of liberty, legal recognition, and freedom from torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Prolonged isolation and the lack of communication severely damage the psychological integrity and well-being of both victims and their families. Used as a tool of repression and control, enforced disappearances in China aim to silence dissent and punish collectively, often with a direct involvement or acquiescence of the state. When committed as a part of the widespread or systematic attack against civilians or targeting specific groups, they may constitute crimes against humanity under international law. The working group regularly engaged with Chinese, Hong Kong, Uyghur, and Tibetan civil society organizations through its humanitarian and monitoring process, and we pay tribute for their tireless and courageous effort.
Video finished right after in thanking everyone in the room for being here. I will, just before opening for Q&A, briefly give the floor back to Sophie, in particular because I think our working group colleague concluded by saying that enforced disappearances as part of a widespread and systematic attack on the civilian population may amount to crimes against humanity. This is a similar finding that you had in your report regarding arbitrary detention. If you could unpack this.
Yeah, briefly, customary international law considers widespread arbitrary detention a crime against humanity, and our research shows at least 1,500 people who are convicted nationwide, all provinces, all regions, all municipalities, for exercising or defending rights. And this figure does not include people who are held in arbitrary pretrial detention or who have been enforcibly disappeared. So I think it is fairly clear that these abuses are widespread and systematic. Since 1993, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has issued 117 opinions declaring 312 people arbitrarily detained by the Chinese government. And it was in 2017 that the working group first expressed concern about Chinese government arbitrary detention as a crime against humanity in the case of Tibetan language rights activist Tashi Wangchuk. And since that time, there have been at least 25 more expressions of concern about arbitrary detention as a crime against humanity. The government itself has taken no positive action in response to these cases. It has not released people in response to these determinations. It has not allowed for country visits by the relevant special procedures or working groups, and instead what it's done is attack the legitimacy of the UN mandates. If I can offer up a couple of quick recommendations, particularly to the Chinese government, which now stands alleged by two different parts of the UN human rights system to be committing crimes against humanity. The top recommendation, obviously, is to drop the charges and quash convictions, to repeal problematic laws and revise them only in conformity with international human rights law, and to investigate and prosecute the implicated officials and adopt all of the recommendations that have been put forward through multiple reviews. And to the other governments, and particularly those who've joined us this afternoon, I think at the top of the list is to request a briefing by the High Commissioner immediately at the HRC on Chinese government human rights violations, including arbitrary detention as a crime against humanity. Hopefully he can make time for that. States can also push to adopt the recommendations that were set out in an extraordinary statement by more than 50 special procedures in June of 2020, that there be a special session focused on China and that a standing mandate on China be established. And then last but not least, individual states can by themselves or collectively establish initiatives to gather evidence of crimes against humanity and work towards methods of actually holding people accountable. We live in a time when universal jurisdiction cases actually proceed, and I would strongly urge all of the governments present to consider that as an option. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And just a last data point also, according to my calculations, the Working Group on Arbitrary, China is a country that has been the subject to the largest amount of legal opinions by the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, outnumbering a range of other countries, including Egypt, Syria, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia. So I think that speaks a little bit to your findings. I will now open the floor for Q&A. We have about 10 minutes, so I'll only be able to take up to 3 interventions from the floor, maximum 1 minute, either a question or a remark. And I would like to kindly ask you to indicate your name or affiliation. I see the Permanent Mission of China. 1 minute maximum, please.
Giving us the floor. China, as a concerning state, China protects the fundamental rights and freedoms of the systems in accordance with its constitution and laws. However, these rights and freedoms are not without boundaries. As clearly stipulated in the international human rights law, all are equal before the law. Chinese judicial organs base their cases on rights and the law. No one enjoys special privileges simply because they are a human rights defender or have a particular nationality. Currently, Xinjiang and Xizang enjoy sustained economic development and social stability, and the rights of all ethnic groups to freedom and religious belief, the freedom to use and develop their own ethnic language and scripts, and the freedom to inherit their cultural heritage are fully protected. Since the implementation of the Hong Kong National Security Law, Hong Kong society has returned to stability, and the rights enjoyed by citizens in accordance with the law are effectively protected. Claims of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance are outright lies. NGOs are hyping these issues to whitewash criminals, interfere with China's domestic judicial process, and smear China. Such actions have nothing to do with promoting and protecting human rights. They are not only severely, violates the rule of law but run counter to the purpose and principles of the UN Charter. Thank you all.
Thank you. Is there any other question or remark from the floor? I'll ask you to raise your hand as I cannot see everyone from where I sit. Yes, please go ahead. I think our colleague from France.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Laura. I'm a representative of the delegation of the Netherlands. I just want to thank the panel for their testimonies and sharing their stories today. It really made me feel a pit in my stomach, so thank you very much. My question is to Mary, the Special Rapporteur on Situations of Human Rights Defenders. I was wondering, you were talking about a platform which would concentrate on China human rights defenders. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on your vision for this platform. For instance, what should the main objectives be, and how could it perhaps also enhance cooperation on human rights in China in a broader sense? Thank you.
Is guided by the nameplate, but is there any last question or comment from the floor? If not, I will perhaps turn to you, Mary. I think you got a. Oh yes, please go ahead, and please identify yourself. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kanyan Wong from Global Human Rights Defense. We are also working on the Uyghur topic, Tibet topic, and also the Falun Gong topic. And we know that with the arbitrary detention, it's also there is imprisonment, kidnapping. A lot of this kind of prisoners of conscience are kidnapped. They are disappearing, and it's leading also to the current topic of organ harvesting. I'm not sure if your association is also working on this topic about the forced organ harvesting by the Chinese Communist Party.
So I'll turn to you, Mary, perhaps first.
Thanks. So first of all, I'm afraid I have to say that we don't look for special treatment for human rights defenders, nor do we consider that they are a protected group that needs special treatment. We just want them to be treated in accordance with international law and standards to which China has agreed. And where your constitution is at odds with those standards, either in theory or in practice, then they need to abide by international standards. So I just say that for a start. And, you know, China has made so much headway on economic, social, and cultural rights. And I know if China put its mind to it, it could also make really good headway on civil and political rights. And for my mandate, as for human rights defenders, these are innocent people who are simply exercising their right to defend rights. Coming to the platform, I would be happy to talk to anyone at a future date, have a Zoom meeting or something where we could explore together the shape of such a platform and how it could operate and what it could do. I think it's important. I have always felt in my very long career that, you know, the best way to create change is to create networks of people who are interested in the same issue and to to mobilize and strategize and work together with a common purpose. So I suppose in a way that is kind of the thinking behind it. And then as a group to be able to inform states and to try and get states involved in taking action, like the contact group that I have that you are a member of, and a very, very good member. You're one of the best, I have to say. You always do the work. Where I send a case of a defender who's facing long-term imprisonment each month to this contact group of states, and they, to greater and lesser degrees, they take up the cases. But Netherlands is always very good. I have to say that because it is, for somebody like me who is used to kind of battling against, clawing my way around the place, trying to get some kind of traction. It's great motivation for me to know that states who have the responsibility to protect human rights, first of all in their country, and then in other countries where universal human rights should apply. Yes, so I'd be happy. All I want to say is I'd be happy to talk about it afterwards, and anyone can join, and I'm sure you would organize a Zoom or something.
We'll organize a Zoom or something first. Sophie, can I go to you, and perhaps with this we will conclude?
Sure. Offer up the following observation, that it's been 8 years. It's been 8 years since the first working group on arbitrary detention concern about crimes against humanity. It's been 3 years since OHCHR said the same. It's been 5 years since 50 special procedures offered up additional recommendations for how to respond to this. We are not short of recommendations on how to address these problems. What we are short on is leadership by the High Commissioner and by member states to be courageous, relentless, principled, and accessible advocates for all of the victims and survivors of Chinese government human rights violations, for Riz's family, for Yalkun's family, and for far too many other families. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophie. You did a much better conclusion than I could, but I just want to add one word, and coming back to Mary's quote since at the beginning of today's event, which is that in the end, solidarity matters a lot. So as the quote went, solidarity is the last weapon of the defenseless, and we really, really strongly hope that we can count on your long-term solidarity with all the victims, all the advocates that are fighting this very long struggle. Thank you so much for joining us today in person and on live stream, and I wish you a very good end of day.